The science is clear. Human activity is a key contributor to climate change, and both are linked to the destruction of ecosystems, leading to rapid declines in biodiversity across the globe. At the recent UN Biodiversity Conference in Kunming, China, more than 100 countries vowed to put the protection of habitats at the heart of policy making. Now, critics warn there's no time to waste. Here in Australia, for example, the iconic koala is fighting for survival. Researchers say that without urgent action, the species could die out in many parts of the country. A second chance at life after narrowly escaping death. 4-year-old koala, Vicky, is among the lucky few who survived Australia's Black Summer last year. It was one of the country's worst bushfire seasons on record.
Injuries sustained obviously was a lot of burns to all parts of their body, their paws, their head, their torso. Smoke inhalation to their lungs was an issue.
Rangers have spent months feeding these rescued animals and carefully monitoring their progress. The goal, to get them healthy enough to return to the wild. Never before had Phillip Island's Koala Conservation Centre taken in koalas that needed such intense, ongoing rehabilitation.
If they hadn't been picked up, they would have died on the fire line. Koalas don't have a great immune system, so any sort of illness or injury can deteriorate quite quickly.
3 billion Australian animals died or became displaced when the unprecedented bushfires ripped through more than 20 million hectares. It's thought that in some of the worst hit areas, up to 70% of the koala population was lost. Scientists warn such extreme bushfires will only become more common with global warming. It's a worrying trend for a species that is already disappearing from pockets of the country. A fragmented habitat and development are driving the problem. Cars, dogs and diseases are also killing koalas. Park Ranger Daniel Kallstrom has witnessed an alarming decline in his local area.
We estimate there's less than 20 koalas left on the island, and if you compare that to, 80s, 90s, I remember when I was a kid in the 80s down here seeing lots of koalas. There was, hundreds of koalas down here.
It's a similar situation across much of eastern Australia. National estimates vary, but some environmental groups warn there could be as few as 32,000 left. It means every koala's life is important. And every success story, a reason for hope. In southeastern Victoria, some koalas are finally back where they belong after months of rehabilitation.
Still got obviously the scars from his burns and everything, but his eyes look really lovely.
Veterinarians are closely monitoring the koala's health. They're trying to understand if the animals can survive in the long term.
11.9. Not only are they back out in the wild, but they've got babies. They're contributing to their population. So, it's really a really wonderful feeling, actually.
Growing fears about the fate of koalas have prompted the federal government to launch a US $13 million protection package, which includes a nationwide koala count. It's being touted as the most extensive census ever undertaken for the species. Researchers are leaning on technology such as drones to uncover the most important areas for koalas. But non-profit organisation, the Australian Koala Foundation, says it has already spent millions of dollars mapping these locations. Their independent data shows Australia has lost about 30% of its koalas over the past 3 years, with numbers declining in every region. Australia's Threatened Species Scientific Committee is also reviewing whether to upgrade the koala's vulnerable listing to endangered.
I definitely think it would make it a little bit easier for habitat preservation too, because there'd have to be special protection zones and management zones set up for them.
Southern Ash Wildlife Shelter founder Colleen Wood nurses sick and injured koalas back to health. But she knows from 2 decades of experience, most injured koalas don't have a happy ending.
You know, we've got this high criteria because there's minimal habitat for these animals to go back to. I find that probably one of the most challenging things. You know, as soon as you get the animal in, you're thinking, where are you going to go? You've got to go back to where you came from. Where's the closest, safest habitat? Is this going to work? You know, it's not just assessing the injury.
Finding enough safe, suitable habitat for koalas is at the heart of the animals' struggle for survival. Over the years, development, roads and plantations have cut through prime koala habitat, destroying much of their food source and putting them at greater risk of becoming roadkill. It's a consequence of a growing population as development accelerates on city fringes and in regional areas. Conservationists warn authorities must do more to protect the last safe havens for koalas.
So we need to be connecting up smaller patches of forests. We need to be planting trees to provide linkages so that koalas aren't having to spend a lot of time on the ground where they're more prone to be attacked by dogs or crossing roads and being hit by cars.
Feeling a sense of urgency, grassroots environmental groups are already taking matters into their own hands. Their efforts include planting thousands of trees for koalas and citizen scientists monitoring the animals.
2 and 1.
All to give the next generation of koalas a fighting chance.
This portion of the mountains of Rizal Province, east of the Philippines' capital Manila, shows what 25 years of reforestation and conservation can bring. Known as the Masungi Geo Reserve, it's home to hundreds of documented species of flora and fauna now thriving on their own. Species in forest lands like this are interconnected. Over-extraction of one or more parts of the ecosystem degrades their natural habitats and food sources. Bringing it back to its original state takes years of caretaking.
Protecting biodiversity is not just a matter of planting trees, or any tree at that. In this protected landscape, the strategy is to assist in the natural regeneration of plant and animal species here. In other words, allowing nature to heal itself.
Assisted natural regeneration involves identifying which trees are native yet lacking in the area, determining their strategic placement, and even avoiding the overgrowth of species that hinder other important components of the ecosystem to flourish. This requires a careful study of the land. Other parts of the Geo Reserve fall within a watershed, still undergoing reforestation and crucial to flood prevention in the capital region, Metro Manila. The more degraded and less biodiverse this so-called Upper Marikina River Basin is, the less capacity it has to hold rainwater, adversely affecting downstream areas. But in the Philippines, danger lurks for those defending forests and borders of protected watersheds against private interests. Those who do this work are often threatened with violence.
This ranger station is where at most 10 forest rangers spend their nights when on duty. It's their home away from home, right at the foot of a reforestation area. But last July, 2 of the rangers here were injured by gunshots from an alleged environmental offender. It's incidents like these that make the Philippines Asia's most dangerous place for land defenders, according to environmental watchdog Global Witness.
Yung tama ng bahay, dito po nanggaling.
A bullet whizzing by wounded the head of Forest Ranger Melvin Ahmad that night. The attack left multiple bullet holes in their quarters. Forest Ranger Kukan Maas was shot in the neck.
Isa yung kinakatakutan ko na mamatay akong araw na yun. Yun yung pinaka-point po. Dahil bukod sa yung nasintraw yung leg ko. So hindi ako gaano makalingon ganyan kasi napakabigat ng leg ko na. Tapos nahihilo ako. Ang kinakatakutan ko, kung mamatay ako, paano yung anak ko, maliit pa lang. Maliit pa lang yung anak ko. Kailangan ko ipaglaban yung sarili ko eh.
The two rangers were eventually rescued, but the harassment continues, like these booby traps and improvised explosives found in the same area. Stationed in the mountain months at a time, these forest rangers conduct patrols, plant trees, and provide witness testimonies in prosecutions, helping fight environmental crimes. The work they do becomes ever more crucial as the climate crisis worsens. Most of the encroachment they fight is driven by commercial interests, including illegal logging, quarrying, and resort development. While mountain resorts and restaurants with views bring people closer to nature, some can also further degrade the environment.
Protecting remaining forests is key, and also ensuring that we do not contribute further to the degradation of our water systems. And we live in an archipelagic country where only less than 20% of our forests are intact.
ASEAN accounts for as much as 18% of global biodiversity, even if it holds only 3% of global land area. The region is home to 3 out of 17 of the world's so-called mega biodiverse countries, including Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. Scientists are pushing for data gathering to determine the threshold by which ASEAN's protected areas can mitigate the effects of industrial development. They hope countries can include natural capital as part of economic indicators, helping ensure that growth does not irreversibly damage ecological resources.
People already talk about, the capacity of forests to sequester carbon, to store carbon. But when we talk about forests, we also talk about the diversity. And the science is important to determine the capacity of nature to absorb such development.
Acting as carbon sinks, forests help mitigate the intensity of extreme weather events. Their degradation affects both urban and rural areas. Residents in low-lying urban areas of Riverside, Marikina City preemptively evacuate each time authorities warn them of possible flooding due to rains. Strong rains for hours could mean deadly 2-story high floods in this area. Many stay in government-run shelters and return home after floods subside, only to be told days later they need to evacuate again.
Nakakapagod kasi pag magandang panahon, uwi kami. Pag makulimlim ang panahon, balik kami. Yun yung nakakapagod sa amin, pabalik-balik na lang.
Prior to the pandemic, I visited this rural tribal community in Mindoro Island, south of Manila, just after a typhoon hit their area. I hoped to see how they're affected by extreme weather events, as the Philippines is Southeast Asia's most typhoon-hit country. What I saw was devastating. Members of the community said each typhoon season leaves their homes in ruins and their crops, their main source of livelihood and food, damaged. They have no choice but to grow new ones and wait for the next harvest season. Extreme weather events, intensified by climate change, give them little room to save up for the future, pushing them further down the economic ladder and limiting their children's chances for better lives. They are often the worst affected when nature is degraded, yet are often exploited due to their ancestral claims to the land.
Ang pumipilit lang, madam, ngayon sa kasalukuyan yung pagputol ng punong kahoy. Kaya tuloy-tuloy ang paglislide sa aming kabundukan. Kaya yung po sanay aming pinuprotektaan mula noon hanggang ngayon, pero binabaliwala yung aming salita.
Climate change, biodiversity loss, and disaster mitigation cannot be tackled in isolation. If exploitative human activities at the root of these issues are not addressed, it will create an endless cycle of poverty and rebuilding for the country's most vulnerable.
Singapore is known as an air-conditioned nation with lush but manicured greenery. But that could change soon, as it's trying to build a more natural and rustic environment, one that encourages richer biodiversity. But what challenges does it face? I'm taking a brief look back in history to see where we are starting. I'm here at an exhibition that traces the impact Singapore's colonial past has had on its natural habitats. This map over here, can you maybe tell me a little bit about what we're looking at?
Right, so we're looking at a cadastral map, and what you can see here in all of these little boxes, those are Gambia and pepper plantations. But what's interesting to note is that in between all these plantations, what you can see is it labels it as brushwood and lalang. This is a result of shifting cultivation where, after you've basically dug up all the soil and no more nutrients, you have to move the plantation, and the brushwood and lalang is what happens in the abandoned area.
What was the scale of its operations during the time?
Right, so the British were a little bit indiscriminate about giving people land leases. By the 1880s, it got so bad that 90% of Singapore's primary vegetation had been deforested to make way for plantation agriculture.
This left post-colonial Singapore ecologically worse for wear. The pace of land clearance has slowed since then, but it's still a serious threat to the country's biodiversity, as I find out on a walk with an eco-activist. Sarah, can you tell me a little bit about where we are and maybe what the space used to be?
So this space used to be the Tagore lentor forest. If you see like the entire grass patch behind, it's basically the entire forest, and it was cleared to make way for private housing, condominium, as well as shopping amenities. It used to be home to many critically endangered species.
Sarah and her group, Lepak in SG, studied Singapore's urban master plans and found that about 6,400 hectares of forested areas are under threat. That's nearly 9% of Singapore's landmass. They are either slated for development or marked as reserve sites, meaning it's not known yet if they will be developed or conserved. The loss of these forests could spell disaster for flora and fauna.
When we sort of cut down such forests, we sort of lose the connectivity between forests. We also lose particular plant species, or we sort of overload its carrying capacity. So if you can imagine, it's like a family of 8 downsizing from a 5-room flat to a 2-room flat. So there's going to be conflict.
Already, at least 28% of nearly 3,200 recorded animal species in Singapore are believed to have vanished over the past 2 centuries, primarily due to habitat loss. Despite this, Singapore is still home to an estimated 23,000 to 28,000 species of terrestrial organisms. These include the world's most heavily trafficked mammal, the pangolin, and the Raffles banded langur, of which there are fewer than 400 left on Earth. To give remaining wildlife a helping hand, man-made solutions have made an appearance. I'm with researcher Andy Ang to find out how they can be a lifeline.
So Andy, what are we looking at here? This is a rope bridge that was built by the National Parks Board last year to facilitate the movement of the Raffles banded langurs and also other arboreal species of animals. This rope bridge has like a mesh along the way, and then there is in the center a guiding rope, so for the animals to actually grab when they cross from one side to another.
Such infrastructure can help animals travel between forest patches and avoid becoming roadkill. More ambitious examples include a 62-meter-long wildlife bridge across a 6-lane highway. But Dr. Ang says although animals may use them, there are limits to how much human patchwork can make natural habitats whole again.
Artificial structures like the rope bridges are only a complement to, I would say, keeping the forest and also planting more trees. Also, we shouldn't be looking at isolated locations. So if you connect places the fragments together. Animals get from one place to another. Where do they go next? Is it a residential area? So we need to ensure that we're looking at the island-wide connectivity.
The agency responsible for Singapore's greenery is increasingly adopting that strategy.
We used to plant rows of monocultured species, same species along the entire street. Soldier-like planting spaced out nicely. Today, they are a mixture of native species that create the structures of a forest. So our planting palette has changed.
These so-called natureways encourage wildlife to travel along them and are also more climate resilient. The agency aims to have 300 kilometers of these paths within the decade. It's also restoring habitats, which is helping to bring critically endangered species back from the brink.
This wetland is typical of the kind of habitats and ecosystems that you will find in forests in this region. It was important for us to restore this habitat because it is part and parcel of what has been historical in the Botanic Gardens. And we know that from the kind of species that we see existing in the forest still.
So what's an example of those kinds of species, Athlo?
Well, this, for example, is the Alstonia pneumatophora. It has been propagated from a very large specimen in the Botanic Gardens. From the propagation from that tree, we have started to plant a number of these Alstonias here. This is one, and at the back, there's yet another one.
With the enhanced greenery, wildlife are finding it easier to move between forest patches to find food and shelter. 3 previously critically endangered species, like smooth-coated otters, have now been reclassified as just endangered. And efforts are underway to help them battle the next big threat on the horizon, the climate crisis.
Instruments like this help to track weather patterns for years, even decades. Using a variety of sensors, it can detect the amount of rainfall, temperature and humidity, the amount of light that plants can absorb for photosynthesis, and even wind speed and direction. And all of this contributes to valuable data that will be used to inform conservation practices for the years to come.
For instance, it could yield critical information like how plants respond to rising temperatures and more erratic rainfall, and in turn, how the animals that depend on them fare. The approach could help safeguard Singapore's biodiversity for the next generation.